Let's talk about one of the strangest, most unpredictable fighters in MMA history. A guy who, at his peak, could go toe to toe with the best in the world and beat them. But just as quickly, he could find himself on the wrong end of a career altering knockout. I am talking about Keith, the Dean of Mean, Jardine. Jardine was a fighter who made absolutely no sense. His style was weird, his striking was awkward, his movement was offbeat. And because of that, he was a nightmare matchup for anyone. Think about this. This dude knocked out Forrest Griffin when Griffin was one win away from superstardom. He beat Chuck Liddell. Yes, the Chuck Liddell, when Chuck was still one of the scariest knockout artists in the UFC. And yet, Jardine's career was one of the most bizarre roller coasters in MMA history. One minute, he would look like a title contender. The next, he was getting knocked out violently. His style was both his greatest weapon and his greatest downfall. So what happened? Let's find out. And where better to start than from the very beginning? You see, before he was knocking people out in the UFC, Keith Jardine had a completely different kind of career. He wasn't some kid who grew up wrestling since age 5, or some Golden Glove boxer with Olympic aspirations. No, in fact, MMA wasn't even on his radar when he was young. Jardine was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in a time when that city was not exactly a hotspot for MMA talent. Yes, today, Albuquerque is home to the Jackson Wink MMA, one of the most legendary gyms in the world. It has produced champions like John Jones, Holly Holm, Carlos Condit, and Rashad Evans. But back then, that MMA scene wasn't really a thing yet. And that's part of what makes Jardine's story so unique. Before he ever set foot in a cage, Jardine worked as a wildland firefighter, which, let's be real, is already a job that requires an insane amount of toughness. Fighting wildfires is not like working a 9-to-5 job. It is brutal, it is unpredictable, and it is physically grueling. You're out in extreme conditions, carrying heavy gear, and literally putting your life on the line. Very much like fighting in a cage if we're being real. Now, even Jardine has said in interviews that his time as a firefighter helped him develop the mental toughness he would later use in his MMA career. It is that same grit that made him one of the hardest fighters to break inside the cage. And this wasn't his only gig at the time. When he wasn't putting out fires, he was working as a bouncer in some of the roughest bars you can imagine. All tough men jobs. Now, if you've ever been to a bar, you know it's not just about checking IDs. It is about dealing with drunk, aggressive idiots who think that they are the next UFC champion. Jardine got into his fair share of street fights during this time. He wasn't a trained fighter yet, but he knew how to throw hands. And he had real-world experience in violent situations. That's when he started thinking, hey, maybe I should try this fighting thing for a living. And that is what he did. Jardine somehow found his way into Greg Jackson's gym, which at the time was not the powerhouse that it is today. Jackson wasn't yet the legendary coach who would go on to train John Jones. But even back then, Jackson had a gift for taking unorthodox fighters and making them effective. And let me tell you, Jardine was about as unorthodox as it gets. His striking was awkward as hell, his movement was strange and unpredictable, and his defense was, well, let's just say it wasn't always great. But what Jardine did have in spades was heart, toughness, and an unpredictable striking rhythm that drove opponents insane. Jackson, being the great coach that he is, saw potential. Over time, Jardine developed a low, stiff stance, a herky-jerky style that made it hard for opponents to time their shots, and a devastating leg kick game. He wasn't the cleanest striker, he wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but what he was damn hard to figure out. After grinding through the regional MMA scene for a while, Jardine got his first big break on The Ultimate Fighter Season 2. Now, if you don't remember the early seasons of Tough, it was wild. Back in those days, fighters weren't just competing for contracts. They were living in a house together, drinking way too much, and sometimes just straight up fighting in the backyard. It was the Wild West of MMA reality TV. And this was fresh off of the success of Ultimate Fighter Season 1. So a lot of people were watching. So even though Jardine did not win the tournament, he made an impression. He was tough as nails, and he had this quiet, mean streak that made him stand out. That's where he got his nickname, the Dean of Mean. And when the UFC saw him fight, they knew he belonged in the big league. Jardine made his official UFC debut in 2005, and right away people noticed something. This guy was different. Still, many saw him as a stepping stone and a journeyman fighter, a good fighter they'd match up with better fighters on their way up. But Jardine wasn't having any of it. In 2006, he was scheduled to fight Forrest Griffin, and this is where things get crazy. You see, up to this point, Jardine was seen as a solid but unspectacular fighter in the light heavyweight division. He was dangerous, but no one really thought of him as a serious title contender. This was the fight that put him on the map. Forrest Griffin was one of the UFC's biggest rising stars at the time. After his legendary brawl with Stephan Bonnar, he was one of the most beloved fighters in the company. The UFC booked Griffin versus Jardine with one goal in mind. Griffin wins. Griffin looks great doing it. Griffin moves one step closer to a title shot. Jardine was supposed to be a stepping stone for Forrest, but apparently he did not get the memo. From the start, it was clear Jardine was not going to roll over. He pressured Griffin, stayed aggressive, and threw his trademark looping punches that looked awkward but landed hard. Then, in the second round, it happened. Jardine landed a brutal right hand followed by a flurry of hellish punches. Griffin crumbled, and suddenly the UFC's golden boy was lying unconscious on the canvas. Jardine had just shocked the world. The guy who couldn't make it in TUF just knocked out the winner of TUF Season 1. Forrest was supposed to be a future champion. He was the ultimate fan favorite, the guy that everyone loved to watch fight. He had an iron chin, a ridiculous gas tank, and an aggressive fighting style that usually overwhelmed his opponents. But Jardine had just played the role of the ultimate spoiler. He walked into the cage that night as an underdog and walked out as a legitimate contender in the UFC's stacked light heavyweight division. And if you thought that was the peak of his career, oh man, just wait, because he would shock the world once again. He went up against one of the scariest knockout artists of all time and walked away with the biggest win of his career. After the Forrest Griffin fight, he became kind of like the wild card of the UFC's 205-pound division. Nobody could figure him out. You could expect him to win against anyone and also lose to just about anyone. Now, I say this because while Jardine was coming off a brutal knockout win over Forrest Griffin, he had also suffered an embarrassing 48-second loss in his very next fight. But more on that later. So the UFC did what they always do when they don't know what to do with a fighter. They fed him to Chuck Liddell. Now, let me set the stage here. Chuck Liddell wasn't just any former champion. He was an MMA icon and a living legend. At his peak, he was terrifying. The man had some of the most ridiculous knockout power in UFC history. He could knock you out moving backward. He could knock you out while barely even touching you. He had one of the most devastating counter-striking styles that we had ever seen. And the UFC thought this would be a perfect comeback fight for Liddell. They thought he was going to walk through Jardine and get right back into the title picture. But just like with Forrest Griffin, Jardine had to play the role of the ultimate spoiler. From the opening bell, Jardine did something almost nobody did against Liddell. He fought smart. Most guys got into slugfest with Chuck and lost. But Jardine knew that he couldn't trade bombs with Liddell. It would be like bringing a knife to someone who had a bazooka. So instead of getting into a brawl, Jardine chopped away at Liddell's legs with brutal kicks. Every time Chuck tried to step in, Jardine hammered his lead leg. And to everyone's surprise, it worked. By the second round, you could see the frustration on Liddell's face. Jardine kept moving, sticking, and never standing in one place long enough for Chuck to land that lethal right hand. He outpointed him, he outstruck him, and when the final bell rang, Keith Jardine had just beaten Chuck Liddell.
And then I was like, oh man, okay, cool. Yeah, let's go rock Anaheim again.
Okay, now you guys weren't together back then, correct?
Yeah, we were. Uh-huh.
Were you at the fight?
Yeah, no, I wasn't.
Okay, so where were you when you were watching him in his big main event fight against Chuck?
I was with friends at home.
That's one of my favorite pictures I've ever seen, by the way. One of my favorite pictures ever. I got it photographed in my brain. Your reaction when they announced that I won.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. Where were you?
It was.
You were on the floor.
The crowd was stunned. The UFC was stunned.
Like I said before, I was just like, man, he hits hard because every time he touched me, even if I blocked it, I kind of zoomed out a little bit. I think at the end of the first round, I started to see some openings, and I felt I started to turn the tide a little bit. There's just a couple little moral victories I felt that I had, and I saw him getting tired a little bit. So I was pretty confident going into the second round of that fight.
And just like that, Jardine had beaten two of the biggest names in the UFC in less than a year's time. People started asking, is Keith Jardine a legitimate title contender? And to be honest, at that moment, it looked like he was. But just when we thought things were looking good for Keith, it started going downhill. Because for all of his massive upset wins, Jardine's style was a double-edged sword. It was unpredictable, yes. It confused opponents, yes. But when fighters started figuring him out, the knockouts came fast and they came hard. Like I mentioned earlier, after the Forrest Griffin fight, the UFC was excited about Jardine. They thought they had another potential title challenger on their hands. So they matched him up against Houston Alexander, a relatively unknown fighter at that time. On paper, Jardine was more experienced. He had faced tougher competition, so he'd win the fight easily, right? Well, we didn't have to wait long to get the answer to that one, as in just 48 seconds, Jardine was unconscious. Houston Alexander had just starched him. From the opening bell, Alexander charged forward like a damn bulldozer. He caught Jardine with a flurry of punches, backed him up against the cage, and unleashed pure violence. It was as brutal and sudden as a knockout gets. To put this in perspective in today's MMA context, imagine if a fighter today knocked out Israel Adesanya and then lost to an unranked opponent. That is how shocking the loss was for Jardine. And just like that, with one knockout, the hype train was derailed. Yes, he'd win against Liddell the very next fight, but the hype of him becoming a true contender was over, and he was starting to get labeled as a fighter who gets lucky from time to time. And what solidified this reputation for him was his fight against Wanderlei Silva, fresh off his win over Chuck Liddell. Silva was another legendary knockout artist, and from the opening seconds, it was clear this was going to be ugly. Silva came forward like a rabid animal, threw a bomb of a right hand, and dropped Jardine instantly. He pounced on him, rained down brutal ground and pound, and knocked him unconscious in just 36 seconds. At this point, things were spiraling out of control. He'd win one fight and get knocked out in the next. He had a huge win against Griffin and went on to get completely slept in 48 seconds by Houston Alexander. He'd find a way to win against Chuck Liddell, but then would follow that up by going to the Shadow Realm courtesy of Wanderlei Silva. Now, if social media had been as big back then as it is today, X would have exploded every time this man stepped into the Octagon. People started questioning his chin, and once that happens in MMA, it is hard to come back from. We have Tony Ferguson's example to look at. And just like Tony, Jardine would go on a 4-fight losing streak, dropping fights to Rampage Jackson, Thiago Silva, Ryan Bader, and Matt Hamill before being cut from the UFC altogether in 2010. And just like that, one of the most unpredictable careers in the UFC came to an end. Yes, he would fight 6 more times after this, but he'd hardly ever win, and his career was never the same. But it wasn't all doom and gloom though. Instead of fading into obscurity, he completely reinvented himself. Jardine had a rugged look, real fight experience, and a reputation as a tough SOB. And guess what? Hollywood loves guys like that. Now, I know a lot of fighters dabble in acting. Maybe they get a couple of roles playing henchmen in some low-budget action flicks, grunt a few lines, and call it a day. But Jardine actually made it in the industry. He wasn't just some ex-fighter thrown into random scenes for authenticity. He worked his way up. His first break came in stunt work. He became a go-to stunt guy for Hollywood fight scenes. And who better for fight scenes than someone who actually used to fight for a living, right? But here's the thing. Jardine didn't just stick to stunt work. He started landing actual acting gigs, where he wasn't just getting punched in the background, but delivering lines and playing characters with real screen presence. And if you've watched TV or action movies in the last decade, you have probably seen him without even realizing it. He first made an impact as a menacing enforcer in Breaking Bad, then went toe-to-toe with Keanu Reeves in John Wick, and even fought Hugh Jackman in Logan, playing one of Donald Pierce's cybernetic reavers. Now that's not all, he has also showed up in Inherent Vice alongside Joaquin Phoenix, played a ruthless mercenary in Netflix's The Punisher, and even made an appearance in Better Call Saul. Now that is one hell of a resume if you ask me.
Keith Jardine has been in movies such as Logan, Running with the Devil with Nicolas Cage, and many others. That's what we're here to talk about. Obviously, you're here with your wife, Jodie Escobar, as she takes on Hannah Cyphers this weekend. Got to talk Hollywood, man. What was John Wick 1 like for you, being in that movie and getting killed by John Wick himself?
John Wick 1 was amazing, man. To tell you the truth, I had a bigger scene with him, man. We ran out of time. We're supposed to get in this huge fight and really elaborate thing, and then we ended up, I just got shot in the head. But
Jardine might not have become the UFC champion. He might not have had the longest winning streak. But what he did have was one of the most unique, unpredictable, and downright entertaining careers in MMA history. He knocked out legends and got knocked out himself. And then when fighting was over, he carved out a whole new career in Hollywood. Honestly, that's a hell of a legacy. So to answer what the heck happened to Keith Jardine, he shocked the world. He fell, he reinvented himself, and in the end, he walked away on his own terms. That is not something that every fighter gets to do.